Well, good evening. Happy Fat Tuesday, and welcome to the second week of Kevin's History of American Architecture lecture series. I want to start out by again thanking each and every one of you in the audience for joining us and for supporting the center. Your registration fees are what keep the lights on in the auditorium, right? Right, yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, we had some requests last week for just keeping the house lights a little bit higher. I'd also like to thank all of our friends at the Smith Group in Detroit for sponsoring this series. This is the second year in a row that they have made that commitment to our work, and we are very grateful. So last week, hey, I'm not even saying my name anymore, and I'm not going to be telling you anything about Kevin because we're all friends here. But I did say that I would tell you a little bit more about some of our programs each week. And so tonight I want to just mention a program that if you're interested, you should probably go home and register for it yet tonight. We have been offering a series of behind the scenes tours, and the one that we're going to be doing this winter is a tour of the arts and architecture of Brookside School. The elementary campus today. It's also really the oldest part of Cranbrook Schools, including the historic meeting house. Because of the very sensitive nature of the inhabitants in that building, it is rarely open to the public. So on Sunday, March 12th, we are going to open it for a series of tours. They're going to be led by Kevin Adkison and our collections fellow, Nina Blumfield. Last I looked, there are some spots on just 2 of the tours. So if you are interested, I really do encourage you to go home tonight and open up the website and register, because my guess is that by this time tomorrow, they will be completely sold out. So without further ado, I am going to invite Kevin to the podium. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good evening, everyone at home and everyone here in DeSalle Auditorium. It's great to be back for week 2 of our History of American Architecture Frank Lloyd Wright lecture series. Now, last week we learned about Frank Lloyd Wright up to 1910. We learned about his background, born in Wisconsin to Welsh immigrants, and we learned about his prairie style of architecture. And had his career ended at 1910, he still would have been a famous architect, and he would have been a sort of vital thread in the tapestry of modernism. But of course, Frank Lloyd Wright's career does not end in 1910. And so here we see Wright around the time of tonight's period of interest, 1909 to 1930. He's here in his 40s in absolutely the worst professional, financial, emotional, and personal spot he's ever been in. The period of time that we're covering tonight is a really tough one for Frank Lloyd Wright. He wrote of himself in 1921, "I'm the freak architect, and this is my fool's work." And he was describing what he could not yet then know would be a sort of decade of drought where very few projects were coming in and almost none were being built. I mentioned last week that Frank Lloyd Wright's biography was critical to how we understand his architecture. And so tonight it will be somewhat of a slog as we get through a tumultuous period of multiple wives and multiple tragedies. Last week, we learned how Wright was born into a sort of bucolic horse and buggy society at the end of the Civil War, and about how his closely held Unitarian faith, his deeply rooted Romanticism, and his sort of 19th century view established by Emerson, Whitman, and Ruskin had led him to seek beauty in every creation of his architecture. Tonight, we will see Wright, this quintessential 19th century romantic, entering into the machine age. He'll bring with him an enormous amount of ego and confidence and his personal way of carrying himself. By the turn of the century, he had already established the sort of pork pie hat, the cape, the cane, and writing about himself in the third person. Now, Wright's practice from the 1890s to 1909 was part of a rapidly expanding architectural profession, both in Chicago and in around the world. His basic outline to becoming an architect of sort of apprenticeship, leadership in a firm, setting out on his own, getting clients, and then building buildings was happening all around the country. What made Wright so unique was his vision for himself, that he was a genius and that he was the greatest architect working. And so the buildings that he built confirmed that vision. And what we'll see next week is Wright again saying, I'm the greatest architect of all time, and then building buildings that will confirm that. But tonight we're in a difficult spot because Frank Lloyd Wright will still say he's the greatest architect of all time, but there's not going to be the sort of evidence behind him. And so the Prairie style is already closed. The sort of organic, inventive modernism of the 30s, 40s, and 50s is ahead of him, and we're left with Frank Lloyd Wright. And what I think is most amazing about Frank Lloyd Wright is his dogged determinism not to allow this sort of drought of clients, drought of work to stop his inventiveness, to stop his exploration, or to in any way really diminish his kind of belief in architecture and the power of architecture. Now, as always, there are the historical facts that many different scholars before me and concurrent to me put together. Then there is Wright's autobiography, which is full of his own facts that he did believe and that he held to be true and important. And then there's the architecture itself. And so we'll be looking at all three of those threads tonight. But let's start with the architecture and where we left off last week with the Darwin D. Martin House in Buffalo, New York of the mid-1900s. Frank Lloyd Wright's achievements in the Prairie style were many. He began treating walls as screens, freeing space rather than confining it. He swung space around open hearths, linking rooms and functions together under broad, expansive ceilings. He abstracted traditional ornament and decoration into planar surfaces and cubic representations of nature. He also simplified and brought together plan, setting, and furnishings into an organic, natural whole. It was, as Grant Manson wrote in 1958, quote, the electrifying reorientation of the American dwelling. But Ada Louise Huxtable, one of my favorite architecture critics, would write a little bit later, 50 years later in 2004, that this period of Wright's work, the Prairie style, was full of artful sentimentality, somber earth tones that would seem old-fashioned to later eyes. Wright had rejected Victorian clutter, but his modernity, bare as it seemed at the time, was still evocatively picturesque in the grand 19th century tradition. It was a balancing act between romantic naturalism and geometric abstraction. And so what Huxtable is saying is that this doesn't look like a Victorian house, but it's really rooted in a lot of very traditional architectural forms. Tonight, we will see how this period of literally wandering in the desert brings Wright into a much more modern way of conceiving architectural space. He will push the boundaries of what materials and buildings can do. He will fundamentally change his approach in how he plans and designs buildings. And most importantly, by 1930, Frank Lloyd Wright has a radically reconceived idea of how to experience architectural space. And so this is where we'll end in 75 minutes at the desert encampment where Frank Lloyd Wright and Olga Vanna Wright spent this winter of 1929. But let's go back to 1909. This was less than a year after Unity Temple had opened and a year before the Roby House was finished. 1909 found Frank Lloyd Wright at an impasse. He was, as he admitted in the autobiography, a terrible family man. He hated the sound of Papa. He viewed himself as more of a child than his own children, and he saw himself as more playful uncle than father. As he said, the architect had absorbed the father. Then the relationship with Catherine Tobin Wright was falling apart. And Wright wrote that everything personal or otherwise bore down heavily on me, domesticity most of all. And so he would, in 1909, close up his Oak Park office and escape to Europe with Mamah Borthwick Cheney. Although he would return to the US a year later in 1910, Frank Lloyd Wright would never again establish his suburban Chicago practice, and he would never fully rejoin Catherine and his 6 children. Wright would describe his actions as a rebellion against a past life, a struggle for inner freedom, a spiritual adventure, and most of all, a voluntary exile. He was running from domestic issues, and he was running away with a new woman, but he was also running away from increasing critique of his work. When Wright's work was taken seriously and positively, it was often seen as something curious or eccentric, and thus not really serious and not really valuable architecture. Critics who liked Wright's work would sort of do backhanded insults by saying that it was, for instance, graceful and charming, but so unusual and bizarre. Or, as the English architect C.R. Ashby wrote in an introduction to Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, "It needs the touch of an enchanted wand to clothe the buildings with a more living and tender detail." And that's one of Frank Lloyd Wright's biggest supporters saying that. As Frank Lloyd Wright wrote, he was weary, losing grip on his work and even his interest in it. Now, 1909 is a critical date because the mood is shifting on Frank Lloyd Wright, but he's also a bona fide celebrity, and he has his first of multiple monographic architectural magazines come out. Here, the Architectural Record of March of 1908, where Frank Lloyd Wright writes an essay on the nature of materials that will become one of his many books, and it features all of the great designs of Wright's career up to that point. And yet, in the very next issue, Russell Sturgis has a complete teardown of Frank Lloyd Wright, the great Gothicist who at that point is a sort of elder statesman of the academic architectural field. Russell Sturgis writes that the Larkin Building will fail to pronounce this monument, or no one who sees it will fail to pronounce this monument an extremely ugly building. It is in fact a monster of awkwardness. And Sturgis critiques not just the building, the Larkin Building, which again is probably his most popular work in Europe to the European modernist, never particularly well accepted in America. And Sturgis says, not only is the building a sort of monster, but Wright himself is totally egotistical, unconcerned with people's feelings, and his buildings are wholly repellent as a work of human artisanship. It might have been a work of art, and it is not. I mean, this is the same publication that a month earlier had sort of given over the issue to him. And so Frank Lloyd Wright and the prairie style, what Wright would have called the new school for the Middle West, was being critiqued. And one of the big insults to Wright's ego was being lumped in as Sullivan and his little band of enthusiasts. And even at this moment, Frank Lloyd Wright's own work is becoming self-referential, while Sullivan, his Liebermaster, who's sort of wandering out in his own struggles, is continuing to further the modern movement. And you have on the left, Frank Lloyd Wright's version of a kind of regional bank, which is essentially another version of Unity Temple without any of the sort of spatial drama. And on the right, Sullivan continuing to explore. Wright was really feeling stuck, and his buildings were beginning to appear stuck. He was also outside of what his clients wanted. Remember last week, the McCormick and Rockefeller mansion that falls through and doesn't give Wright that sort of entry into Chicago style because Mrs. McCormick, née Rockefeller, chooses to go with a New York classicist building an Italianate villa. And so Frank Lloyd Wright finds himself having really invented this prairie school of architecture and then limited by the Prairie School. It's become an academic exercise where on the screen you're seeing just some of the over 75 buildings he builds between 1900 and 1909, but it's beginning to feel quite rote. These are the pieces, you put them together, it's in a suburban grid, and that's it. Some historians will go so far to say that the conflicts in Wright's family life were simply a manifestation of the stalled artistic life. I don't know if I buy that, but it is just all of a piece. His practice and his personal life are coming to a standstill. And Wright would later write, "Because I did not know what I wanted to go away." And so he runs to Europe. He would equate this move with the same move that he made leaving the University of Wisconsin to move to Chicago without any degree or particular training. He leaves his practice, he leaves his family, and he sets out for Europe. And that's not that shocking of a path for an architect to take, except that Frank Lloyd Wright is already famous and has never been to Europe. He was offered the opportunity to study at the Paris's École des Beaux-Arts in 1905 by Daniel Burnham, the sort of grand classicist of Chicago. Burnham wanted to send Wright to Paris for 3 years and then to Rome for 2 years, and then come back to Chicago, a well-trained gentleman architect. Wright declined that offer and went to Japan instead in 1905. And we'll see the continued influence of his interest in Japanese and Asian cultures throughout his entire career. But he sort of has snubbed Western architectural history by not going to Europe. And he's not embarked on the grand tour that since the 18th century had really been a critical part of any architect's training, to go and see the great capitals of Europe. But he's also professed in writing and in all of his sort of architecture that Europe has no influence and has no meaning. He's an American architect, so what will be the excuse to allow him to go? The invitation by the German publisher Was muss Verlag to print a new series of 3 monographs about Wright's work, 2 major monographs with lithographs and then a smaller photographic album. The publication house had been established in 1871, and it was the leading German publisher of books on archaeology, art, architecture, craft, costume, and ornament. And it was going to be, for Frank Lloyd Wright, his first major publication and his first major introduction to European audiences. And so he uses this invitation to Berlin as his sort of excuse for getting to Europe. Now, in the meantime, Mamah Cheney, who was quite an independent woman, she had designed a house with her husband Edwin in 1903 and 1904 with Frank Lloyd Wright. She was a graduate of the University of Michigan. She worked in a public library. She was a feminist. She was an independent thinker, and for the past several years had been the lover of Frank Lloyd Wright. She takes her children to Colorado, leaves them with a dear friend, calls Edwin and says, "I'm never coming home." She drops his name. She'll be Mamah Borthwick from that moment on, and meets Frank Lloyd Wright in Berlin. They meet at a very luxurious hotel funded by the Kaiser, the sort of grandest opulence that you could have in pre-war Berlin. And Frank Lloyd Wright checks them in as Frank Lloyd Wright and wife. The problem with that was that Catherine Tobin Wright, Mrs. Wright, had already been jilted, and the press knew this. And so as the Chicago Tribune reporter was doing his rounds of looking at the records of the hotel, he sees Frank Lloyd Wright and wife. He knows Catherine, the wife, is in Oak Park, and on the front page of the Chicago Tribune on November 7th, 1909, the scandal is revealed, declaring Wright having abandoned his wife with an affinity tangle unparalleled even in the checkered history of soul mating. Now, in that article, Catherine would call Mamah a vampire. Wright's behavior was attributed to being spoiled as a child, to being a mad artist, and an outlaw, and they were no part of a decent society. And so Wright and Borthwick really have to go into hiding, and it makes it very difficult for this critical year of Wright's career, seeing Europe, making connections in Europe, studying the architecture and landscapes, that he's doing it in hiding. He's not sending letters. He never keeps a sketchbook. He's not really recording what he's doing or what he's seeing. So I bring this lecture to you tonight on the backs of scholars like Anthony Alfonson, who have researched only this year of Frank Lloyd Wright's career to try and figure out everything they saw. And we do know quite a bit. They stopped staying in grand hotels, and they even spent some time apart as Wright went around Germany to look at modern architecture. Now, his favorite German architect, and the one who influenced him the most, was Joseph Maria Ulbrich, but Ulbrich had died quite young at the age of 40, the same time Wright's arriving in Germany. So he goes to Darmstadt to see the artist colony, which will become one of the sort of critical buildings leading to the modern movement, the modern style. Wright admires the sort of shape of the building, the abstraction, the massing, and Wright is joined in admiring these buildings by other future modernists like Eliel Saarinen, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe. They're all going to admire these same projects. But Wright is most touched and most influenced by the Viennese secessionists and Ulbricht's building for the succession there, which Wright immediately says, aha, here is my influence in Europe. You know, there is certainly influence of Wright back to the Europeans, but it's also a case of these styles existing in parallel, the whole way that you have artistic movements that emerge at similar times in vastly different cultures. But it really wasn't the modernist in Germany that Wright was most impacted by. It was the Italian landscape. And he didn't set his home base as Berlin, but as Florence in Italy. And so he sits up here to create the drawings for his portfolio to be published in Berlin. And he is joined by a studio assistant, Taylor Woolley from Oak Park, and then his eldest son, Lloyd Wright, who is seen here with his drafting apron. And they work on redrawing all of Frank Lloyd Wright's projects. And the benefit of redrawing for publication is that Wright can edit. He can modernize, he can stylize the depictions of the buildings so they look exactly concurrent to what he's just seen in Berlin and Vienna. And so it's the first of, or not the first, it is one of many instances where Frank Lloyd Wright will either predate something. Remember, he spent his whole life saying he was 2 years younger than he was, just to be more precocious. And he'll edit buildings. And here he's depicting the Larkin building in the exact same style as the secessionist movement. He never depicted the Larkin building like this when it was being proposed and constructed. He was using much more conventional architectural renderings, but now he's in Italy, he's redrawing the buildings, and he is saying, I invented this style, I am the first, I am in conversation with these Europeans. He's also studying the same Italian landscape that had influenced Edith Wharton and Maxfield Parrish with their seminal text on Italian villas. This whole community in Frizzole, Italy, was really a sort of bundle of impolite society. There were queer artists, there were independent women, there were feminists, there were all sorts of people who didn't quite fit in polite society, meaning that Mema and Frank were able to exist in this world outside of Florence in sort of great comfort and harmony. And one of those people was Edith Wharton, who had been in Frizzole before, and her analysis of the Italian landscape and how the transition from fixed and formal lines closer to the Italian palazzo shifts into an irregular pattern of nature, a subtle and gradual change across the Italian landscape that Frank Lloyd Wright will pick up on and deploy throughout his career. Now, I think this was a very happy time for Borthwick and Wright. They existed outside of the press. They existed outside of the fact that they were both married and both had children back in Chicago. And at the end of their time in Italy, Wright dreams up this home and studio. It was, for him, I think, less so an actual idea. He does have a conscience. He wants to be back with his family. He also wants to be back in his home country. But he views this project as almost a sort of capturing the dream of this moment, of this time they've spent together. And he proposes his own sort of modernist palazzo with internal garden and double height music and drafting studio. Now, when he returns to Chicago, it's the start of the Chicago Renaissance. Artistic production is moving along. And in order to be at all accepted, which he's never really accepted into polite society again, he has to move back in with his family. And he tells the press, I'm patching things up. He has no intention of doing that. And so he takes the home and studio, which, remember, had been this sort of continental exercise in living and working together. Very unusual for an American architect that the family and the practice were in one building. They shared meals together. It's what Eliel Saarinen and Loya Saarinen would do here at Cranbrook. Wright had done that in the 1890s, and now his first project back in America is to literally split it apart. And he'll have Catherine and the children living in the front of the house, renting out 2 apartments in the back so that she has income. Meanwhile, he designs a new house for his mother and himself in the Gold Coast, which is a sort of adaptation to his Italian design, double-height living room, music room, and garden. But this does not really, it's never really seriously considered, because in his time away, Anna Wright, his overbearing mother, has purchased property in the family valley in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And so Wright, on paper, is designing a house for his mother. However, his elderly mother is not in need of a drafting studio. That's always in the blueprint. So he's still having to sort of balance these issues of appearances. He needs to look like he's living in Oak Park and not building a retreat for Mamah Borthwick and Frank Lloyd Wright in Wisconsin. And so he acquires the land through his mother. He designs the house under her name, and it's going to be in relationship to 2 of his earlier projects, the school that he built for his 2 aunts, and then the windmill on top that is bringing water up to the hillside. And he will plan his new home, Taliesin, around the hill. And think of how tight his plans had been for the prairie houses by virtue of almost all of them being in a suburban lot. They are called prairie houses, but he had not actually worked in this sort of rural setting, or in the case of Spring Green, this kind of highly cultivated farming landscape. And so now Frank Lloyd Wright is beginning to break apart the house and wrapping it along the side of the hill. The plans were drawn up in April of 1911. Borthwick returns in June to Canada, and later that Christmas, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mamah Borthwick are moving into the house on a hill, Taliesin. The name itself comes from the Welsh bard, a 6th century writer, poet, and mystic who literally translated, it means shining brow, and that referred to Taliesin's actual forehead. Frank Lloyd Wright uses it as a sort of mistranslation to mean the shining brow of this hill. And his house, Taliesin, is not on top of the hill, which would make it more like the Acropolis. It would turn the hill into a podium for the architecture. Instead, the house is built with the side of the hill. So he maintains the top of the hill and wraps the home around it. Access is through underneath a porte cochere into a little motor court, and then you're divided between a terraced garden in Edith Wharton's manor on one side, the studio on the other. His home is straight ahead. And again, the similarities of the Italian terraced garden coming back to Wisconsin. This is not something that existed prior to that trip to Europe. The house itself is cleaved in 2, work on one side, home on the other, and it also allows you to really feel that the hill and the architecture are one, that they're flowing back and forth together, that you are always sort of aware of being on the edge, on a ledge, and it's described as sort of the experience of being on top of the trees on a ledge, as opposed to inside a house. He's no longer sort of orienting the living room towards the fireplace. Now it's in a diagonal corner set opposite a view out. He's very concerned with this view. He is planting trees, manipulating the landscape, putting a dam in so that the water level will raise so he can see the water through the valley. And all of it will appear to be, quite perfect, quite natural, but it is all part of his architecture. Again, thinking of his idea of nature as being one where everything can be controlled and should be controlled, because we as man are also natural creatures. And so all of this is sort of beautifying the natural surrounding, making it a more perfect setting for Taliesin. And here you see the house as it would be at the end of his life. This is his sketchbook. He rebuilds it over and over. And Frank Lloyd Wright would describe Taliesin as being all front yard. And so it really is this kind of garden architectural landscape that is very much in vogue with the sort of idea of a country estate. Think of other people building country estates like George and Ellen Booth here at Cranbrook. This is the idea. You move from the city and you go and you build a sort of gentleman's farm. But what Frank Lloyd Wright has done is built it with nature in this new architectural style. Now, moving around the site, you move through these terraced gardens and you move through these rooms. And this is new. We've exploded the room, we've eliminated corners, we're having floating planes, but we've also now eliminated the formality of the Prairie House. And just look at Taliesin on the right versus the Willits House on the left, one of the first Prairie Houses. We've lost that sort of centrifugal force that takes us to the hearth. We've lost the suburban lot. And this expansion, this sort of whirling out at a diagonal, is going to lead Wright's career throughout the next years. And the materials are also different because what you have here, instead of the Roman brick or the plaster or the concrete, which he almost always used as monolithic materials. If it's a brick house, it's brick from the bottom to the top, inside and out. Here, it's different materials. It is more natural. It is more homemade. It feels more rustic. It feels more picturesque. It also was meant to be really kind of experiential and tactile. And so the limestone is quarried on site. The sand from the river that runs through the site is used in the plaster. And then the cedar shingles on the roof are weathering to the same natural hue. It really is this sort of indoor-outdoor naturalistic site, in part because he also doesn't have any money to build it. And so he's having to use local materials because he can't get a loan, he can't get a mortgage, he can't get anyone to sort of front him for the materials. And so the house is built experimentally and on the cheap. Now, what was actually happening here between Borthwick and Wright was a very productive relationship. While he had been working on the portfolio in Italy, she had been in Sweden learning Swedish in order to translate the works of Ellen Key. Key was a Swedish feminist who wrote that the only valid bond between man and woman was one based on equality and love. Her ideas sort of enriched Wright's vision of a new social order, and they also provided a moral justification for both of them leaving their families, that they were following this sort of more pure and elevated relationship. And Key would become one of the sort of foremothers of the feminist movement, and Borthwick is translating her works here at Taliesin. They also translated Goethe together. And then when Wright was gone, Borthwick was actually in charge of the drafting room. So she really was a sort of right-hand woman to Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, his career is bouncing back. We have projects on the board, different banks, theaters, his first skyscraper. Not a lot of them are being built. I use here just the Sherman Booth House to say, for all of this sort of inventions of Taliesin, he's still working in this prairie mode. The most exciting project on the drawing boards was a sort of entertainment complex on the south side of Chicago, built where the Midway playground had been at the 1893 World's Fair. It was meant to be a beer garden, dance hall, and concert venue among the sort of factories of the South Side. Now, Wright does this incredible drawing, which has these sort of effervescent plants and balloons emerging. It's all with electric lights. And the architecture is this kind of permanent celebration. It's a festive indoor-outdoor venue. And so the architecture reflects that sort of joy within a fairly formal order. You go into the courtyard and you have just this absolutely massive enterprise, including the first concrete bandshell ever built in America, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. What I think is interesting beyond this very German import, which about a quarter of Chicago businesses were run by German immigrants, and so very much he's part of this German community. But his modernism has not gotten any less ornamented through his trip to Europe. He has really leaned into the idea that ornament is a vital part of architecture. And this in 1913 is putting him at odds with the most radical of the European architects. Wright deploys these ornamental motifs because, as he says, ornament is the primeval desire to coexist with the earliest attempts of civilization. And so for him, even if he's building a modern building, there is still this deeply romantic sort of root to a building. There should be something to tie it to you as an experience. And for him, that is ornament. And in the case of Midway Gardens, figural ornament, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and Alfonso Iannelli. And the ornaments are based on primal shapes. So we have the return of the Froebel blocks, not just in the architecture, but now in the sculptures, where you have the triangle on the right, the square in the center, the octagon on the left. And where is he getting these? But Vienna. And so he is designing these out of his own imagination and memory of the work that he had seen by Joseph Hoffmann. Now, this building was being torn down around the same time Frank Lloyd Wright was in Vienna. So he may have seen it. He may have only seen photographs, but he does credit these as being the inspiration. And what this represents is a new way of abstracting the human form into the architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright had not achieved this prior to his trip to Europe. Before, if you remember, he was always putting the sort of winged victory, or he was putting classical sculpture, and he was trying to abstract and sort of dilute nature, essentialize nature into a geometry. Now he is essentializing man itself into a geometric form for the building. It doesn't stop there, though. The relationship between the secessionist and Wrights continue. Looking at just kind of any Viennese interior, you can see the influence on Midway Gardens all the way down to the dishes, which Frank Lloyd Wright designs. And the very idea that an architect would be designing a sort of total work of art is a great Germanic kind of arts and crafts secessionist idea. And Wright has seen also modern painting, and so his own decorative motifs change, where before it was almost always on a grid or on a diagonal. Now we see the introduction of the circle. Now, he will never allow anything to be pure abstraction. And so he says that in his mural at Midway Gardens, these are the sort of effervescent bubbles of champagne coming up over the bar. The design of the gardens was finished by the spring of 1914, but construction would continue for the coming months as he worked to finish all these details. Wright and his son John were living on site, sleeping on, according to him, piles of wood shavings. And it was here at Midway Gardens where Wright got news on August 15th, 1914, that Taliesin had burned down. He boarded a train to go back to meet his family and see the catastrophe. And when he got off the train in Wisconsin, the same train that Edwin Cheney was on, he learned that it was much more than a fire. It was arson set by his cook, who had locked all the doors and windows, poured gasoline around the house, and set fire to it while the house was sitting down for lunch. When they attempted to escape the fire, he hatcheted them to death. And so Frank Lloyd Wright's partner, Mama's son, John, her daughter, Martha, two draftsmen, Herbert Fritz and Emil Brodel, as well as Taliesin's carpenter, William Wetson, and his son, Ernest, and the foreman, Thomas Brunkner, and the gardener, David Lindbrom, were all murdered on this date. This is the transformational trauma of Wright's life. I mean, I don't know how you ever emerge from this. He suffers from deep depression. He suffers from blindness, from boils. He loses weight. He has no creativity. He really is suffering. He buries Mama with all of her garden, which he cut down the day after the fire, in an unmarked grave where he said, "Why would I want to be reminded of the worst day of my life?" And this traumatic event results in a depression, and it fundamentally changes his desire to work at all and work in the Middle West. Now, as he is receiving letters of condolences, letters of critique, ministers saying this was damnation for his sins, he receives a very intriguing one from a pretty horrifying person, Miriam Noel, who will become his second wife. Now, Noel was a divorced and independent woman, a sculptor working in Paris who had moved back to the United States at the outbreak of World War I. She dressed in turbans, scarves, ropes of beads, furs, long gowns, and capes. She wore a monocle, smoked cigarettes, and exuded a sense of sophistication and mystery. To Wright, she appeared in a time of desperate need to both acknowledge and share his genius, but also share his interest and to exist within his high aesthetic sensibilities. What Wright couldn't have seen were her issues with drug abuse, her wild mood swings, and her unreasoning anger and acts of vengeance. And they were to begin an affair the day that they met, and it would last 8 years between 1915 and 1923. And they would be some of the most difficult years of Wright's life. Now, as he is starting this new relationship, he's also starting two important projects. On the left, the Imperial Hotel, the right, the Hollyhock House. And this architecture is interesting to me because both projects are sort of conceived before the fire. So it's not as kind of direct rebuttal to the trauma. But they are so much more classical than anything he had built in recent decades. They're planned in this sort of Beaux-Arts method. And we'll look at each of them. The Imperial Hotel had been commissioned in 1912, but doesn't get off the ground until October 1918. He had designed it in Tokyo and in Wisconsin with Borthwick, and now he was living in Japan with Miriam Noel for almost 4 years. He lives in Japan until July of 1922, and Wright argues that his hotel, which is one of the first great modern Western hotels, certainly the first in Japan, but also the first of its type, is the logical extension of the American Pullman car, the American ocean liner, and now an ocean liner on land. Of course, with Japan entering in with the Allies in World War II, or World War I, he will say it's now a battleship of hospitality. It is a structural feat with floating support so that when the earthquake hits, and it hits the day the hotel opens, the entire hotel floats. And it is one of the few buildings that survives the seismic activity that rattles Tokyo in 1923. His engineer was Julius Kahn, brother to Albert Kahn here in Detroit. He also worked with a team of Czech, German, and Japanese engineers and architects to realize this pretty eccentric building. And I find the Imperial Hotel to be a little hard to get into. It's demolished, so you can't visit it. And the material choice of these spotted iron spot yellow brick and then Oya volcanic rock mean that the almost frenetic level of architectural ornament really makes the Imperial Hotel hard to read. It is texture on texture on texture. And it is a series of spaces interwoven together that are layered in with Wright's textiles and furniture. And it comes to a high point in the Peacock Ballroom at the very top, where you are again surrounded by all of Wright's vision, including this sort of permanent celebration. And we see again this sort of cubist impulse to have floating spheres and rectangles in space. And that comes down from the electric light all the way to the dishes. Now, Wright will leave Tokyo in July of 1922 with the north wing of the hotel finished. It marked the conclusion of what he called his Oriental Symphony, part of about a half-dozen projects in Japan designed by Frank Lloyd Wright and finished by Japanese assistants after his departure. When he was asked to describe his accomplishments in 1924, Frank Lloyd Wright said, "The Imperial Hotel of Tokyo, Japan, and 176 other buildings of note." And so he is thinking of the Imperial Hotel as his greatest work. And imagine the disappointment when it's not given that kind of respect that he thinks it deserves. It doesn't launch his career as an institutional architect. It doesn't launch his career as an engineering architect. It really is an outlier, a Western building built in Japan, and a sort of dead end for Wright professionally and aesthetically. Importantly, at the same time he's in Japan, he's trying to build a building in Los Angeles for a client who is in Europe. So you're already setting up for failure here, and then put two great personalities. Eileen Barnsdall had come from a wealthy family, the only child, the heir to a great oil fortune, America's first oil fortune. She had enormous amounts of money and a commitment to the Little Theater movement. She knew the Wrights from Chicago, where she lived, and she commissioned a theater there in Chicago, visited California, and who could say no? And she says, "Wright, let's build it in California in the Hollywood Hills on top of a compound she purchased on Olive Hill." It's a pretty amazing site for her home and theater complex. It was surrounded on one side by the San Gabriel Mountains on the north, the San Bernardino Mountains on the east, and the Pacific Ocean on the west and south, with Los Angeles in the valley below. It was an acropolis on which Frank Lloyd Wright was to build an entire complex that was made up not only of her house at the center, a sort of salon, but then a theater, production studios, movie houses, and then all the facilities you would need for a sort of theater and movie enterprise. And the neighbor was one that kind of, I don't know if it paralyzes or inspires Frank Lloyd Wright, because he's now an American architect working in a natural style in a landscape he's never worked in. He's not familiar with California. It was easy in Japan because they had asked for a Western building. So he sees the landscape, he sees Mount Fuji, he builds in response to that, but it's a very sort of, he studied your prints and he's giving you a Western building. California will demand a different response because he needs to build an American architecture, but now he has a landscape that is significantly more monumental, more romantic, more colorful, more dramatic. He's always infatuated with the idea that he's building on the Pacific Rim of fire, this sort of earthquake zone of too much water or not enough water, of fire and earthquake. And also the fact that her neighbor is Nebuchadnezzar, because she's building in Hollywood. And at the time, these huge films, like Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments or The Thief of Baghdad, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, were being built on the lots around Olive Hill. And they would leave the sets up as advertisements of the movies. And so Frank Lloyd Wright has almost this surreal situation of building a permanent work of architecture next to these very temporary stage sets. And think of his influence at the World's Fairs in 1893 in Chicago or 1904 in St. Louis. He has a familiarity of the idea that architecture can be an impermanent exercise. And he thinks of the Hollyhock House as in relationship to both the landscape, but also to this emerging Hollywood scenography. And so he proposes putting the theater at the lower end and then the house up on the hill. The theater will never be built. It's plagued with problems. Norman Bell Geddes is Barnsdall's scenic designer, and he loathes Wright's design. So the theater won't happen, but the house will. And she asked him to explore all of his fantasies, to build the best building he's ever imagined. And he starts with what is a pretty conventional prairie house, if not one unique for its symmetry. Then he thinks that's not the right roof for California, and he goes to a almost teepee form. And finally, he settles on the sort of truncated mastaba form that defines the Hollyhock House. It's difficult to construct with Wright in Japan, Barnsdall in Europe, and so it's led by Richard Neutra, Rudolf Schindler, and Wright's son. And Wright is sort of flying in and or sailing in and out to work on it. And here, just a sense of scale of her property and her project on this Olive Hill Acropolis. But the plan is really interesting because it is so formal. It is more formal than Wright's early prairie work, and it has none of the sort of domestic inventions that he had at this point been known for. Instead, it is a sort of civic building in line with what he would have found in Europe, particularly the Legion of Honor in Paris, a great 18th century building that, like the Hollyhock House, is organized on major and minor courtyards, arcades, and then major rooms that are in sort of semicircles and rectangles flowing together. And this sense of discovery as you move through the Legion of Honor of room after room unfolding again. But Wright said he hated Paris. He didn't spend a lot of time there. How would he have seen this building? It was reconstructed in San Francisco in 1915 at the World's Fair there, which Wright had attended. And so Wright has explored this sort of French design and really adapts it into the Hollyhock House. Now, we'll sort of walk around it in images. The main entrance to the house is along the drive to a motor court here. And you come in through the front door here, but that's not, it's not really a house. I mean, she hardly ever lives there. She gives it away in 3 years. She's not a client in any conventional sense. And so instead, what Wright has done is built a sort of American, Californian romantic temple. And so I want us to stay outside the building, which Frank Lloyd Wright said a California house must be half house and half garden. And so you look, here is a woman of the theater, and he's built this sort of theatric landscape going down towards a house. You can see this passageway for this staff connecting the two wings of the house. in a blind arcade is acting like a theater proscenium. And it's framing this view into a garden, which he designs on the manner of Edith Wharton as half formal, half informal. And when you turn and look, you really get a sense that this is a sort of theatric production. And as you move underneath this sort of curtain of wood and stucco, you find yourself in the courtyard with the main living area of the house straight ahead. But I want us to continue treating this as a temple and go up the stairs, because that's where the excitement of this building comes from. The ability to now occupy the roof as a full extension of the house. You wouldn't really want this in Wisconsin or Chicago, and it is a direct sort of conversation with the use of roofs as functional living space in modern European architecture. But Wright adds his ornament, he adds his drama, and he also adds this sort of Hollywood sensibility that you are walking through a film. You are experiencing the house as if it is a series of scenes, a series of actions. Perhaps you know what they are, perhaps you don't, and you arrive at sunset on the very roof of the house, and you are overlooking the sort of queendom of Mrs. Barnsdall out all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's sequential, it's ceremonial, it's like a temple. It's much less a house than it is a sort of monumental, abstract expression of space, of pure architecture. Of course, there actually is a front door to the house. You don't have to just spiral up it, but the door is quite odd. It's very hidden. Wright has developed this technique of compression and release that he'll use throughout his career. Here, it takes on a rather dramatic form where the walls can't end towards you, and the house could have been made of concrete, but it's made more like a World's Fair or a stage set. It's a wooden house covered in stucco, but the doors themselves are solid concrete. And so you approach these very heavy concrete doors, and I include these handles just to show that Wright has not lost his interest in total works of art. He's designed the door handles, he's designed how they open up, how you unlock the door, and then on the inside, how light is moving in to the space. But you enter into this very abstract, neutral space. You have no sort of sense of where the house is going or what it is. Again, it's sort of monolithic expression of materials now filled with mica. So the whole house is glittering. It is sparkling on the inside. And you turn and you approach the living room, not straight on, but we're going to have to turn at a diagonal. And this is his new shift, his new interest in experiencing space at the diagonal, where now the hearth, instead of being sort of anchored and looking opposite the view, we are coming in at an angle across the fireplace, at an angle to the view, and what's catching us in the corner is a Japanese screen, which Wright has placed, taking advantage of the panelized system to erase the corner with a depiction of his beloved Japan. Now, he sets the furniture at a diagonal, and then he does a portrait of Mrs. Barnsdall over the fireplace. And so this can be seen as her with the sort of sun and moon, the landscape, the mountains ahead, sort of a very abstract depiction of this sort of acropolis that's been built. What's interesting about this fireplace, though, is that this is not just sort of fire at the center of a home. It is water, there's a fountain underneath it, then there's fire in the center, and then there's air and light coming from the skylight above. So just as the outside is this sort of domestic temple, now we have here, controlled by the architect, owned by the homeowner, all of the elements of nature. And there is this deep sort of mysticism that imbues the Hollyhock house with so much drama. As you get closer to the view, you see that Wright still has his predilection of using art glass to frame and sort of mediate, to soften the edges between how we see the landscape and how we experience the house. He resists this idea of a glass box. Then there are other moments where you have these almost sort of like militarily framed views out across the Hollywood Hills. And when you don't have a view, he leans into an art glass interior. Now, the furnishings out throughout the house are just very strange. He has sort of left the arts and crafts vocabulary. He's left the secessionist. He's left the sort of craftsman. And he is in this sort of period of experimentation that it is a direct reflection of the architecture of the house and the hollyhock flower, but it's also just very odd. And the whole house is odd. It is viewed as being deeply out of step with architecture at this moment. The machine aesthetic was taking over in Europe. The functionalists in the Soviet Union were already developing their theories, and America's skyscrapers were the new vogue. And here Frank Lloyd Wright is designing this dramatic, this mystical, this strange house for a Bolshevik multimillionaire. And I just want to quickly sort of place it in context of the early 1920s. What else was happening? In Los Angeles, Bertram Goodhue is designing the public library, this great transitional classical and modern building. Elsewhere, Goodhue is building one of the earliest Art Deco skyscrapers, the Nebraska State Capitol. Both of these buildings would receive much more acclaim and probably have more influence than the Hollyhock House. But for most wealthy Californians, they were turning to the Spanish colonial revival and East Coast architects who had come at West and were now churning out these charming villas. And what's interesting is that the Hollyhock House is essentially a Spanish colonial revival villa in Mesoamerican drag. I mean, it's the same floor plan. It's the same way of sort of indoor-outdoor living. So it's what you want to live in California, but Wright is out of step with what clients want. They want it to look like a Spanish mission. And elsewhere, there's even more experimental architecture in California, like Irving Gill's tilted concrete constructions built for the philanthropist Ellen Scripps, the aunt of our Ellen Scripps Booth, who in La Jolla commissions Gill, another great Midwesterner, come to California, and he casts the building on flat trays and then tilts it into place. This is experimental American architecture. And who was Irving Gill's assistant but Lloyd Wright? Frank Lloyd Wright's son had left Wisconsin to work for Irving Gill. And even Wright's own apprentices are defecting. And Wright doesn't have a ton of kind of landmark architects who come out from under him. But the big two are Richard Neutra and Rudolf Schindler, both of whom will leave Wright's practice or stay in LA when Wright leaves LA. But Schindler's concrete house is much more experimental and much more influential than the Hollyhock House of the almost exact same period. And it's always danger to compare American art history to European art history, but we must because Wright sees himself in conversation with Europe. And just look at what Le Corbusier is doing at the same time. Here was a machine for living. What has Frank Lloyd Wright created? And we look at the interior and the shocking sort of contrast between where architecture was going, where the discourse was, and what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing. And I return to this idea of this sort of strangeness to Wright's 19th century romanticism. He can't build a machine for living, even though he's one of the first promoters in the 1890s to say it should be art, craft, and machine. He must tie to history. And so when he sees the landscape, he sees the California environment, he says, I must tie us back to the Maya. This is the natural architectural form. He had not been to Mexico yet, and so where is he getting it? But a World's Fair. He had seen these models at the 1915 World's Fair, and he comes back, and this will change the sort of visual language of his architecture, particularly places like the Governor's Palace, where we see not only his sort of red square appearing, but also the texture that will define his next Los Angeles houses. And the next houses are interesting because the Hollyhock House is such a one-off. Mrs. Barnsdall is so rich. She is so singular. She's so eccentric. She doesn't really want the house. She wants an edifice. She gives it away to the city almost as soon as it's done. But next, Frank Lloyd Wright has a more conventional client. And for Mrs. Millard, this is her second Frank Lloyd Wright house. He had built her Oak Park house before. She's now a widow. She's working in Pasadena as a rare book dealer. And he designs La Miniatura. And it is built of a textile block system that I won't go into too much how it works, but essentially they're custom cast blocks that are threaded through with steel rebar and then filled with concrete to create an almost textile woven material that Frank Lloyd Wright said could be prefabricated and assembled without skilled labor. It is machine production for a machine age. He is now in conversation with bigger architectural themes, and yet the aesthetic result, the end result on the left, is still very much in his design language. So he hasn't sacrificed this sort of romance and this need to be tied to history, but he is now working in the machine age. And the direct comparison between the two houses is to Le Corbusier's Citroën, which is like La Miniatura, a house elevated one story above. In the case on the left, they're in a floodplain. Le Corbusier just wants the car to go, and then a two-story living space and a functional roof deck. But while Le Corbusier was saying a house is a machine for living in, his house was built of wood and plaster. Wright's was made mechanically through cast concrete. Le Corbusier envisions that they could be combined into sort of endless abstraction. We can tear down Paris in his rather cynical Plan Voisin. And Frank Lloyd Wright envisions a very different deployment of his technology, covering the Hollywood Hills in 25 textile block houses. Here, he proposes that none of the houses will alter the landscape. The roads will move under, above, and through the architecture, and the architecture of precast blocks will fill in the gaps until you're able to raise the house in the air. He'll build 4 of these textile block houses that will not particularly be international successes, but they do free his mind. They free him from the sort of juncture of the prairie style. Wright will leave Los Angeles in the early spring of 1924, never to work in California, or never to have an office in California again. However, with the completion of the Innes House and the Freeman House, Wright will have no more work for the rest of the decade. Only 3 buildings will open before 1930, and mostly his personal life becomes utterly catastrophic. The relationship with Miriam Noel collapses. He falls in love with Olga Vanna Hinsenberg, married to a Russian architect. She divorces her husband. She moves into Taliesin. Miriam Noel finds out. She gets the feds involved. They arrest Wright for the Mann Act. Frank Lloyd Wright's house is auctioned off by the Bank of Wisconsin. He becomes a fraud in dealing Japanese prints because he had been duped by Japanese dealers who overprinted him. His life, his finances, it's all a mess. And he is not working on a lot, but he's working on something. And so my last projects I'll leave you with are Frank Lloyd Wright's vision for 2 distinctly different, equally dramatic landscapes, both of which will open up his eyes and set us up for Frank Lloyd Wright in 1930. First in Lake Tahoe, where he uses a technique from the Europeans, photo montage, his only photo montage, to layer in his designs of the buildings. It's very hard to see, but they're these sort of inspired by indigenous architecture. He calls them a wigwam house, squares rotating on squares to create architectural space, architecture floating as a movable unit. They look quite historicist, but the ideas are becoming shocking. The idea that a floor plan is a square and a square, the idea that architecture can move. And then he goes from 6,000 feet above sea level to under sea level, and he goes to Death Valley. And this is his introduction to the desert. Unimportant, this project, but it gets him to the desert, and it proposes to him a new American landscape. And Wright again suggests that he'll build a house. Now for his new lover and later wife, Olga Vanna, he'll design this sort of almost Kiva-like cave desert dwelling. And less important than this house, which only survives in these 2 sketches, so it's not particularly articulated, it's kind of hard to see what's happening. Wright has fundamentally changed how he is now thinking of architectural space. He has just read Okakura's Book of Tea and discovered a description that aligned with his new thinking, that the same way a tea bowl holds the space within it, the room, the building holds space within it. And Frank Lloyd Wright uses this idea to completely changed the way he was thinking about architecture. No longer is it ornament, no longer is it how the building looks or how it is planned, it is the space that you are occupying. And he will go back and he'll rethink of Unity Temple and the Larkin building, all within new spatial language. He'll redraw those projects and he'll begin designing buildings like this, which are open at the top and bottom, existing on a diagonal. And the sort of manifestation of this vision is with the desert camp that we started with, where think of how sort of structured, how laced up his prairie buildings were, confined to a suburban lot, confined within terraces, confined to a hearth. Now his buildings ramble. They exist on a diagonal. They float in space, much like a Cubist painting, and they are ephemeral. They are made of wood. They are made of canvas and linen. He says, I have simply created an architecture with the desert, not on the desert. He is enclosing abstract space as architecture. And within this concept, he's also experimenting. He's experimenting building the camp. He's experimenting there on the left with a proposal for a major hotel project in his concrete block system. And so by 1929, Frank Lloyd Wright has divorced Miriam Noel. She passes away shortly thereafter. He's married Olga Vanna, who already has borne him his 7th child. He's adopted her child already. But what's he going to do next? Philip Johnson, this story may be apocryphal, but Philip Johnson and Alfred Henry Russell Hitchcock are talking about at the Museum of Modern Art, who will they include in their upcoming International Modern Show? Hitchcock says, we have to include Frank Lloyd Wright, and Philip Johnson says, we can't, it's only living architects. Frank Lloyd Wright himself told Architectural Record in 1929, I've been reading my obituaries to a considerable extent over the past year or two and think with Mark Twain, the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. At the same time, Wright was very fearful that they were all right, that he was done. He hadn't built anything other than this sort of desert encampment and other drawings for close to a decade. His latest buildings in LA were not well received, and he's fearful that he will be like his mentor, Louis Sullivan, who spent almost 30 years after his last major work wandering in the desert. Frank Lloyd Wright, though, will not sort of allow this to defeat him. He still says he's a genius and he still has a vision of himself, even if there's not an architecture to support that. He looked at his own death with a little bit of humor. He's 57 at this point, and he says, I need to design my tombstone. If not, I'll be given something in the Louis Sullivan style. Younger architects saw him as an eccentric and irascible old man whose time had come and gone. He had no money, he had a new family, he had no clients, but he was about to engage and embark on an artistic and professional relaunch. He had written his autobiography and he was setting out on the next journey. And that is where we'll pick up next Tuesday. Does anyone either on the Zoom or in the actual audience have questions? Yes.
More modern writers said that you could find some romanticism architecture in Frank Lloyd Wright. I believe you were talking about the home in Buffalo. So what romantic aspects would you find in Frank Lloyd Wright?
So what I tried to argue last week and sort of is going to be the thread through the whole 5-week series, because I think it is the thread that links Frank Lloyd Wright. He is a 19th century transcendentalist in the manner of Emerson and Whitman, and he will never leave that. And that is very interesting because how as a genius, and he is a genius, how do you square your theoretical grounding, the way that you are understanding the world, being out of fashion by the time you are a child indoctrinated in that, and then wildly out of touch with the sort of space age in which he is building the Guggenheim. But because of that root in nature and in beauty and in 19th century romanticism, all of his projects are, I think, deeply humane. They're deeply experiential. It is why Frank Lloyd Wright in a slide lecture is deeply unsatisfying because he has this spirituality to his work that Le Corbusier, as a sort of horrifying cynic, doesn't want spirituality. Le Corbusier actually wants a machine for living. Interestingly, the first American critic of Vers une architecture, Towards a New Architecture, Le Corbusier's seminal text, is Frank Lloyd Wright, and he says it's a great book. So Frank Lloyd Wright is not existing outside of these architects who are escaping romanticism in favor of pure abstraction, pure form, mechanized architecture. Instead, Frank Lloyd Wright is adapting a new visual language, a new spatial language to fit with very deeply rooted and very out of date romantic ideas. He is essentially a Victorian architect all the way to the end, even if his product is not Victorian at all. Other questions? And Emma, if anyone's watching the Zoom, I'll come back here. Yes.
Property and.
Great question. I'll repeat it. After the fire in 1914, what happened to the property? He rebuilds it. Again, I must say, I am bogged down in the biography of Frank Lloyd Wright. So if there are questions like that, that's a great one. He does rebuild the house almost immediately, but he doesn't want to live there. Intriguingly, the major change is that he leaves an opening, and so that there's always a clear shot between the house and Maima's grave at the church in the valley. And so there is, I said at the beginning, his biography and his architecture can't be taken apart. And that to me is the kind of clearest manifestation of biography and architecture coexisting. He builds his feelings. He works through it, through his craft. He rebuilds it in 1914. It burns down again through an electrical fire, and he rebuilds it in 1925, and he never stops rebuilding it after 1930, because as we'll learn next week, he opens Taliesin the school. And so he vastly has to change the house's operation, and the house becomes his sketchbook, and he is changing it constantly. It's why the photos are kind of a poor demonstration of that house, because that 1912 house exists for so short, but that was a static product. Taliesin never again is sort of left untouched. He never has enough money. He never has the right materials. It's all falling apart. They suffer those consequences to this day. But the house continues to be his home and laboratory. And it's not really until he marries Olgivanna that he wants to live there again full time. Other questions? One from the Zoom: which Frank Lloyd Wright houses in California are open besides the Hollyhock House? It's definitely the Hollyhock House, owned by the city of Los Angeles. She gave it to the city in 1927. They allowed it to sort of ruin. They have reconstructed it and reconstructed some of the outbuildings as well. So it's now flourishing. And there is a wonderful book called Wright Sites that is a guide from Princeton Architectural Press that goes through every publicly available Wright site. I did choose for the lecture to highlight every building I'll be highlighting is open to the public, and everyone I have been through myself. So as always, the slides are not the best way to understand Wright's architecture. You really have to go out and experience it. It was what converted many a Frank Lloyd Wright naysayer to his aesthetic, because it's why I can't understand the Imperial Hotel. It's why I will not most likely use any of those 3D generated lost Frank Lloyd Wright projects. I like them, I look at them, I read them, but there's something deeply wrong about Frank Lloyd Wright's representation. For someone who dealt in images, the disconnect between the experience and the image is always extraordinarily profound. You see the Washington Monument, you see the Capitol, they're pretty similar. You see the Louvre, it's very similar to what you imagine it will be. A Frank Lloyd Wright building is always going to twist you, turn you upside down, and otherwise enchant you. And with that, I think that we are out of time. The last question on the Zoom was his sons worked for him. He did at the birth of each child. I think I mentioned it in the evening lecture. He always announced their birth as saying, a sculptor was born to Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright, and they all became involved in the arts. So he predicted it and they manifested it. And so 2 of his sons would work with him all the way through the end of his life and maintain the firm later. And really all 8 of his children are involved in his ego in his enterprise, the family business, Frank Lloyd Wright Incorporated, which after tonight he is Frank Lloyd Wright Incorporated because the Bank of Wisconsin foreclosed on his estate. Darwin Martin purchased it and incorporated Frank Lloyd Wright as a person so that he, as a business, so that he could not again lose his practice. And with that, I'll see you next Tuesday. Feel free to email me with any thoughts.